Once again, please continue to enjoy your lunch. Of course, we're about to start our second lunchtime panel, but I wanted to take a moment to do something. Earlier today, our colleague Marie Baptiste made mention of her new volume, Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage, a Canadian Obligation, which has just gotten published and I guess will be widely available very soon. I'm really pleased to introduce this second of two lunchtime panels with a focus on leadership and how it might be associated with the topic that we're here for today, this week, Indigenous engagement. This panel is one that reflects the Tri-Academy Partnership's hopes about what we hope to learn about today. It seems that essential to the reconciliatory journey that we've been talking about so much is the leadership of Indigenous peoples in academic institutions who can inform change and program development that is desirable to that particular institution. This panel will feature representatives from universities in Western Canada who will describe how they have partnered with Indigenous peoples to support their right to participate in decision-making in areas of importance for them, including such things as academic governance, institution building, land stewardship, and retention of Indigenous languages. And to help with this important event, Deanna Redder has been so kind to serve as moderator for this. Deanna is a professor at Simon Fraser University. Of Cree and Métis background, she is a founding member of the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, established in 2013, the Indigenous Editors Association, established in 2019, and the Indigenous Voices Awards, established in 2018. Her 2022 monograph, Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, received a 2023 ACQL Gabrielle Roy Prize. Her research focuses on the neglected Indigenous literary archive in lands claimed by Canada. So it's a pleasure, Deanna, to have you serving as moderator. I'll leave it over to you now.
Thank you, everyone. Deanna Redder Nitsikasan. Even though I have family all over the prairies, my Cree and Métis family, my Neyao and Apito Kustan relatives are from northern Saskatchewan. I want to start with a little story, partly out of respect for our Maori colleagues who are here, but also thinking about Yaris's amazing story this morning, of which I think we all can relate, all of those of us who have been on many service panels. And it also because I think it links to the question of our panel today, which is how can we make lasting change? So it happens that, first of all, like I think many of you, I've served on many panels as as part of committee work, as part of service loads. And frankly, before I was tenured, I didn't even know that I could say no. And then since, of course, you're tenured afterwards, you just feel the obligation and you keep saying yes. And then I happened to be recently in conversation with a young scholar, she's Stalo, a natural leader, who spent 10 years with Maori teachers down under. And she has been hired in a school at Simon Fraser University where she's the only, or the first, and for a long time, the only Indigenous faculty member, where, of course, people would come up to her and say, oh, you're here to indigenize us. And she's looking with very wide eyes. And so anyway, she was put on a committee with 4 full professors. And she looked around and she spoke up. And she said, this isn't a safe space for me. We have to change this. And even as she's telling me this story, because I'm much senior to her, I was gobsmacked. I thought, this is the leadership that we need. It was partly her strong style training, her own leadership abilities, but I'm thinking also some excellent training from her Maori teachers. And so I think if we were thinking about what kinds of change, long-term change, it's those kinds of training that we can share with each other. And so I just wanted to start today's panel with that little story. Okay. I'm very pleased to introduce for our first panel, Rod McCormick, who's Haudenosaunee, a full professor, research center director, and the BC Research Chair in Indigenous Health. So his research has attracted $60 million for Indigenous mental health and research capacity building. And Dr. McCormick is a provincial, national, and international consultant in Indigenous mental health. Professor McCormick has been named a fellow in the Royal Society of Canada in 2024. So yes, let's welcome him.
Well, thanks for taking the time to listen to us during lunch. It's wonderful for you to do so. So Sego, my name is Rod, and I'm Ganegahaga, and I'd like to acknowledge Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, whose traditional lands that we're on currently. Thank the RSC. This is my first RSC event, and so far so good. More Indigenous than I thought it would be. I'm sure the next few days will be less Indigenous, but who knows? So yeah, where's my, there it is. So Coyote, I worked for 20 years on this coast at UBC, and then went to my partner's home territory to Kamloops and live in her community. And on the west coast, the raven is kind of the transformer or trickster. In the interior, it's the coyote. And so I just labeled my talk Becoming a Coyote, because you really need to be a trickster if you're going to transform the academy. So I started off as a college and university counselor, and then I was assistant professor and director of NITEP at UBC. Talk about not changing your name, modernizing your name like the Royal Society. NITEP graduates refuse to change the name. Native Indian Teacher Education Program. So it's a bit 70s, but it's celebrating its 50th anniversary. So it's got its own brand. Let's see, second slide. That's me. Okay. I'm not doing it right. Where do I point? Yeah. Oh, there we go. So that's the NITEP logo, and you might notice that it's a raven with the sun in its beak, and that's from a West Coast legend that at one time the world was in darkness, so raven flew up through the hole in the sky and brought light to the world. And we used to say in NITEP, one time education was in darkness for our people, and then raven transformed it. And now education, instead of being used as a tool to separate us from our culture, was being used as a tool to reconnect us with our culture. So bringing light. And it's similar to what Murray Sinclair, the quote, education got us into the mess, education is going to get us out of the mess. So that was the idea behind NITEP. I think SUNTEP and BUNTEP are even older than NITEP. So these Indigenous post-secondary programs were going 50 or more years ago, started. It's me again. So when I started working at UBC, I had a mentor named Verna Kirkness, who I just celebrated her second retirement party last summer at UBC. She's like 90, and she's been in Indigenous education for 70 years. Not 17, 70. But her questions to me, because when she was retiring the first time, she gave the House of Learning over to Joanne Archibald to run, and NITEP, our Native Education, over to me. But her interview questions were, I see that you can cry in public, Rod, but can you use shame, guilt, blackmail, the media, and other ways of trickery to facilitate change? Because that's what you're going to need. And she was right. I used all those in 32 years, and they work. Joanne Archibald, being the diplomatic West Coast, humble, calm person, she was able to affect change through more patient and diplomatic ways. Being Kanya Gahage, we don't really have it in our temperament to be really patient and diplomatic. Graham Smith, who helped us at UBC for years, and Linda Smith, and even at TRU, they've helped us out. He talks about calluses on your hands. You have to have those calluses on your hands. I would argue you need calluses on your hands, your knees, your heart, and even your soul. And what probably prepared me best for academia was I was a military officer for years. So you learn hierarchies and competition, and so it was, I think that prepared me best for academia. In those days, well, I guess I'll say that the early 90s were not friendly places for Indigenous peoples. And I mean, it's gotten better. It's still not a super welcoming, friendly place, but it's changed quite a bit since I've been involved. Over the years, I've noticed. My clinical practice and research is in psychology, but I've been involved in capacity building in Indigenous mental health and in research for the last 25 years. Let's see. I've got what? Oops, wrong way. So I've run a number of capacity building projects, BC, a cadre, Aboriginal capacity and developmental research environments, that's a mouthful. And then near BC, network environments for Aboriginal health research, Cloche Tillicum, another renewal of that. Then when our funding during the Conservatives, they did away with our NEARS. So we had an interim Indigenous Mentorship Network. I ran the coordinating center for that. And finally, at TRU, Knowledge Makers program. So instead of focusing on graduate students, we focused on training Indigenous undergraduate students to do research. That has grown. So we're up to Journal 9, so this is the 9th year. And it's grown to include other universities from Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. These are some of the ones we work with. And Sydney, up at the top, they went through our Knowledge Makers program, some of the students, and one of the coordinators went back and started their own Indigenous undergraduate journal called Blackout. And I think they're the second issue, and they've dedicated a page in each one to Knowledge Makers as their inspiration. I was very kind to them. More recently, we started, and that's my logo on my medallion here. My daughter designed that, so that's why I'm promoting it. We were asked by the United Nations if we could do a Knowledge Makers cohort to train Indigenous women from 20 different countries to do research on food sovereignty and climate change in their own countries. 17 finished the training program, and that journal is just coming out. It's in the UN publication stream, which takes forever. I think we're on stage 3 of 10. They measure everything, font sizes, and you've got to be so geopolitically correct, and it's a very colonial group to work with. But an exciting part of that is just yesterday, we received word that the Smithsonian Institute in Washington wants to give us an exhibit to share this work on Volume 8 and bring in some of the authors and some of our former knowledge makers to talk about research. And they were going to make it a political event. The UN said, well, congressmen, senators, and the president and vice president. That, I'm sure they weren't anticipating the results. So I think I'll send my associate director to go to that. Don't really want to meet the new president and vice president. So an important area of leadership has been in changing policies. So working from that transition from research being done on us, for us, with us, and finally by us. And CIHR, which Malcolm King was one of our scientific directors for 8 years, The Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health was very critical in making space for Indigenous peoples within the tri-agencies. So I served on for 3 scientific directors and currently the chair of the current advisory board. But years ago, again under conservatives, they decided to streamline CIHR and merge our institutes and merge our peer reviews and so on. So we formed an advocacy group called Kawatsiri, and we forced CIHR to reverse all those decisions. And we had 10 things we asked for, and we won all 10. But it involved several cabinet ministers, the Canadian Medical Association, all the national Aboriginal organizations. Like, it was a major advocacy move. And so what we did do is ring-fenced. We sat up one night with Malcolm saying, let's ask for 10% of their CIHR's $1 billion annual budget, knowing we'd get 5, and we got 5. But that was quite an improvement. So the other big win was iterative peer review. We basically blackmailed the president of CIHR into giving us iterative peer review. So our success rate went from like 3% to like 30 or 40% using iterative peer review. So like many of you, working at trying to change the institution, worked on things like hiring practices, indigenizing academic freedom policies, indigenizing tenure and promotion guidelines, working on Indigenous governance, Indigenous identity, and so on. Our union actually has been pretty supportive of these changes. Professor Lovett quoted Gaudry and was working with Gaudry's work on indigenization, performative indigenization, which is what we more or less have at most of our universities. And it's not the same. Okay, here's an example from my campus. So they put the stop signs in Sequet machine. That probably only cost a few $100 in paint to do. They had banners all around campus. Kwiselkanus, we're all related. That probably didn't cost much. I noticed they've been replaced with our sports team banners now, Wolfpack. I was going to take a picture of it. But there's a coyote, which is prominently placed on top of the roof overlooking the center of the campus. So I don't think they realize that coyote actually is a trickster. Going back to the beginning, remember those first 2 logos, NITEP and the House of Learning logo? The House of Learning logo is made up of ravens. And they had beautiful sweatshirts that I probably gave a few hundred out to faculty and administration. But essentially, it was a subversive logo that we came up with, where the ravens were transforming the institution, making them Indigenous. And all of my colleagues would probably wear it around campus, not realizing that they're advertising the fact that we're trying to take over their university. Just a couple of final points here. I think, so indigenization does not mean colonization. And the question, I guess, is can the academy, meaning universities, be decolonized, or do we need our own? Another point is a primary goal of Indigenous faculty is to serve community. And I guess that's the last point I'd like to make is, sitting in the back, we've got 5 PhD students who have decided, as a result of Lestwiwe, the 215, that they want to take charge of their own healing in their own community, and so they're getting their PhDs in mental health related topics. In addition, those that aren't already registered are getting registered as psychotherapists in BC. So they're taking an additional 6 courses and hundreds of hours of practicum on top of their PhDs because they want to lead their own healing in their communities. So I think it's a wonderful example of serving community, of what universities should be doing. It's partnered with USask. It's been a struggle to get my own university to support resources, but it's like the Knowledge Makers program. Once we're successful, then they're happy to support us. But we've got to start it ourselves, I think. Finally, I guess one of the things that I'd like to say, and I guess I do have that last, so here's the cohort, our first field trip. We're off again next week to Aotearoa and Fiji. So yeah, finally that I've been saying this for 25 years, how we've transitioned from research being done on us. Ultimately, we want it to be done by us. And I guess I was told not to use this metaphor, but when you get to a certain age, men are advised to get colonoscopies, which I've had to do a few times. And what I'd like to say is, if we play around with the words, we don't need any more decolonize-oscopies. We've had so many royal commissions and everything else. I think we know part of that is cancerous, so we need to get on with the decolonize-ectomy. I guess I better leave it at that. Thank you.
The next speaker is Nadia Joe, or Gagela Tletko, who is Associate Vice President Reconciliation at UConn University, a Gordon Foundation Jane Glasgow Northern Fellow, and a Trudeau Foundation mentor. Gagela has dedicated her professional career to applying respectful and practical ways to protect Indigenous knowledge and heritage. Please join me in welcoming Gagela.
Oh, stories of transformation. Thank you for that, Rod. So originally, I was invited here to speak on some of the institutional direction that we at UConn University are moving towards. But I think, like many of you and many of the stories that I've heard yesterday, my heart is traveling heavy this week. First, of course, with the passing of Honorable Murray Sinclair, the man who not only invited us to do the work of climbing mountains, but really embodied the strength of mountains within his heart himself. And then again, early this morning, when I woke up to the news and the outcome that sees a convicted felon occupy the most powerful seat in the world. But in this sorrow and in this heaviness, I lean on the teachings of my elders, the teachings of my ancestors, and I am reminded again that grief is one of the biggest indicators of love. And so today, in this space, it is from this place of love for our world and love for worlds yet to come, that I'm reminded to simply return to the strength and the teachings of my ancestors. The voices that continue to speak to me in dreams, that in spite of everything that has been done to erase our languages, our stories, our knowledges, our memories from these lands and from these places, that we as Indigenous peoples are still here and we will always be here. So please let me introduce myself to my Inkrakatma relations. So I carry my grandmother's name, Tletko, in my mother's language of the Inkrakatma peoples. It translates as rain falling on water, and it is a name that I received in ceremony following several years of work that I did with the Nicola Nations in first negotiating and implementing Canada's first agreement to collaboratively manage water resources between Crown and Indigenous nations. In the language of my father's people, Dakwanje, danke kakala uye kajatan ich a amanaket ko uye atadake uye krugatan iche kwanlin yunin j. So in the language of my father's people, I carry my grandfather's sister's name, Kakala. I'm a member of the Crow clan from the Champagne-Ujak First Nation, and we are a transboundary and self-governing First Nation. We cross the boundaries commonly known as southwestern Yukon, northwestern BC, and southeastern Alaska. And to my co-Salish hosts here, where I spent about 25 years of my life learning, loving, and playing on these lands, I will always step gently on these lands for as long as you will host me, and I will always listen to the voices of your ancestors while I'm here. And I also want to add that I'm so grateful to both sit among the many mentors and leaders that I've learned from, including Rod here on the stage, Marie, Carla, Maggie, and many of those who have been invited here today who can't make it, Graham and Linda Smith. those that have spent their careers, their lifetimes, essentially carving out pathways for generations of Indigenous peoples like myself to continue shaping and co-creating new paths and new futures that might nurture the learner's spirit through truth, healing, and reconciliation. So this morning, while listening to the news and reflecting on the uncertain futures and perhaps quite turbulent waters that await each of us, I thought I would step back from the rather narrow focus of my work at UConn University in creating an action plan. I've got the only printed proof for reconciliation, and all the goals and actions that help frame and advance our university's commitments towards reconciliation, many which actually align with many of the outcomes of your working group discussions that you've had early this morning. And instead of focusing on that, I thought instead I would take some time to really just ground myself in the practices of reconciliation and being. So a lot of us focus on reconciliation and action and all of the doing and all of the activities. But really what I'd like to return to is how do we focus on being in good relation here today with each other and with the lands that we're occupying. So I've been really grateful and feeling really, really blessed to be able to witness all of the various practices that Indigenous peoples are coming here with us today, the various songs that have been shared, the various stories, the sharing of ancestral lines, because these are the ways that we move towards being in right relation with each other. And while the rest of the academy can grandly occupy itself with the responsibility of educating the mind, my primary interest in my role at my university is really educating the learners' hearts, to borrow a phrase from Marie's book, Decolonizing Education. Because for me, institutional transformation first requires that personal transformation. And so while I can speak to the policies or collective agreement, the various strategic plans, or even the legislation that governs us, it's far more important to me that I foreground that conversation with the co-creation of ethical space here today and share with you instead some of the teachings that I've received from my many elders and mentors. And so firstly, orienting us towards the practice of being right relation, I want to bring forward some of the teachings that I've had from my elders. And so in this practice of introducing myself to you in my ancestral language, our naming system in my culture was designed in such a way that my elders, my relation here today, that they might recognize me as kin. It's a way not only that they recognize the bloodlines that we share, but also the storylines, the song lines, the dream lines, the dance lines that we share, together with all of the responsibilities that my name carries as an individual for my clan, for my community, for my family. My elders have also taught me that when I speak the language of my ancestors, that I'm inviting them in to share this space with us here today. And it's a reminder to me to draw on the strength and the wisdom of their words in guiding my actions and my intentions here with you. It's also a practice for those of you who are visitors to introduce you to listening to a language that is almost as old as this land itself. But I think most importantly for me, as a child of 2 survivors of a residential school, it is to speak out loud a language that my parents and my grandparents once had to whisper to each other in darkness. So as Deanna mentioned, my English name is Nadia Jo. I joined UConn University, which is now Canada's newest university, newly named as of Wednesday as the 97th university here in Canada, and it is the only university north of 60. So I joined 14 months ago as their new Associate Vice President Reconciliation. And I come to this role not as an educator, not as an academic, not as a scholar, not even as an administrator. I came to this role only because one of my elders, a former Nashadahane, or chief for the Karkros-Tagish First Nation, his name is An Goshu, or Mark Wedge. He approached me while the university was courting me quite intensively last summer, and he pulled me aside for what he likes to call a tobacco ceremony. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the tobacco ceremonies, it just means going outside for a smoke. So after stepping outside for this ceremony, he was asking about how I was doing, how my heart was doing. He knew I was encountering a lot of change and turbulence in my life. And he was asking what I was considering in terms of next steps after leaving UBC and the role that I was occupying there. And as I was sharing all of my reasons for not coming home, he stopped me, he interrupted me, and turned to me and simply said, "You know what, Nadia? We need you." And so one of the cultural teachings that I received from my grandparents, from my aunties, and from all of my elders is that when an elder asks you to do a job, you do it. You do it the best that you can. And your title never matters in that. And so as Associate Vice President, Reconciliation, the role that I've assumed is to lead the strategic visioning, the planning, the dreaming for ways that our university can meet its commitments towards reconciliation. And I also want to recognize that this isn't the work of just one person, of just one role. Like the work of our elders and of our communities, the work really centers on creating connections, building community, and learning to weave our stories together. Because for us as Indigenous peoples, the practice of coming together and telling our stories here is not only to preserve our memories, but it's a way for us to imagine our future. And so for me, the real story of the University of the Yukon began when the leaders from our 14 First Nations in the Yukon came together to tell their stories of inequities and what was happening and what they were seeing. And what emerged from these shared narratives was this vision that was captured in a document entitled Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, which was presented on Valentine's Day in 1973 to Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. And this story formed the basis for negotiating comprehensive land claims agreements and the establishment of Indigenous self-government, which at that time had not yet been done in Canada. And then in the final third part of this document, my leaders outlined a plan for investing in education of our youth of my generation, the first generation to not attend Indian residential school. And so it was in this plan where our leaders envisioned a university that would welcome Indigenous students and grow the leaders that our nations, Yukon First Nations, would need for a shared future. And their love was big enough to include a future that benefited not only their children, Indigenous children, but all children of the Yukon. So it was from this dream that the reconciliation framework, this document that has only just been endorsed by our board, has emerged. And so the document itself really draws from generations of Yukon First Nations pedagogical practices. It draws from prayer, it draws from song, it draws from story and weaving and dreaming. And while much of it was written in a bit of a sleepless, dreamless state in the first 2 weeks of my job, much like how I imagine many of you write your grant proposals, all of the thinking and the dialoguing and dreaming that is reflected in this document happened long before our institution actually became a university 4 years ago. So while the framework itself has been endorsed by the board, the moment of transformation that really stood out for me was on May 31st when the members of our Indigenous Advisory Circle, and this is an arm of the board, so all of the Indigenous members on our board are invited to a subcommittee of the board, the Indigenous Advisory Circle. And after multiple readings and multiple endorsements, we stood up and they danced this document into being. And they said, we recommend this to be brought forward to the board, and we endorse that. And for me, that was a real moment of transformation of how we bring these practices into our institutions. So this dreaming, this dancing, this storytelling was for Yukon First Nations, remains an essential source for our instruction, for the ways that we learn the standards for living well together on the land, ways that we sustain good relations with community, with clans, with family, and our more than human kin. So one of the first guiding pieces within this document, it's grounded in story, grounded in a transformation story, what my old people call Kwadai Kwandur, one of these long ago stories. And it's a way of preparing us for a transformed world. So after witnessing the election results last night, and witnessing this risk that all of us face of this further dissension into a world of misinformation and division. The role of education in transformation and growing the kinds of leaders for future worlds feels especially urgent to me right now. Because as we witness and experience what the erosion of democratic rights and the impending climate collapse signals for our life together on this planet, we need to be actively building a world of dreamers. It is no longer enough for us to simply engage our minds, our intellect, our cognitive capacities, and our understandings of the world and our place in it. We really need to relearn the practices and the stories, the transformation stories that move us all towards being in right relation, the practices that activate our dreams, our imaginations, our visions, and our hopeful capacities. And so this, for me, means learning to tell a new story together, not only about our planet, but what our place is in it. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me, and please enjoy your lunches.
In fact, this is an excellent moment just to congratulate Yukon University for becoming the newest university in Canada. So please join me. This is fantastic. The next speaker is Andrea Reid, who is a Nisga'a scientist, a citizen and scientist, engaged in community partnered work on fish and fisheries, critically examining their pasts and envisioning just futures. Andrea's research and teaching, based out of the Nass River Valley, center approaches that are intergenerational, land-based, and relational. Dr. Reid is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Fisheries Science, leading the Centre for Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. Please join me in welcoming her.
Waisimgagat, Sigadam Hanak, Kobawilksa, Kranix, Kubat Ilk, Andrea Lwa, Niskani, Xim Laskik Ni, Wilps Quikants, Wildewitgui, Lakaltzap Jagai, UBC Center for Indigenous Fisheries, Wilhatla Arsi, Luamp Gadi, Chiefs, matriarchs, members of the noble class. My name is Andrea. I'm a proud Nisga'a citizen. I come from the Eagle clan and the House of Quikants. I'm Nisga'a on my paternal side, maternally of Irish descent and raised outside my territory. But today I get to call the Nisga'a village of Lakaltzap home. And my work, and truly my pleasure and my privilege, is running the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, UBC. My heart is happy. My heart is truly happy to be here with you all as a fellow guest on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and to sit on this panel about institutional change and program development, because there are so many changes that are needed. We've heard that throughout our days together. And we've already heard, this recollection of the late Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair's words on education getting us out of this mess. And it's this kind of education that we're talking about in this space over these days that really needs to come forward. It's not the forms of education that have gotten us here. I'm excited to be here as my first engagement with the Royal Society of Canada and, of course, the Tri-Academy Partnership. And later this week, I'll be inducted into the RSC's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. And with that, I'm very excited to be... With that, I'm very excited to join in these efforts to grapple with what it means to be a member of these so-called learned societies, which is a continuation of the work I've already been doing as a National Geographic explorer and as a fellow of the Explorers Club, challenging the very foundations of these institutions that center doctrines of discovery, conquest, and terra nullius. How can lands like these, Lisms, my homelands, how can they be nobody's lands when they have belonged to us? And of course, they've belonged to themselves for millennia, since time out of mind. The lens that I want to apply to the conversation today is one motivated by the words of a colleague of mine and really of all of ours, an RSC fellow, Dr. Daniel Heath Justice, also based at UBC, on imagining otherwise. He says that Indigenous peoples know what it is to face the end of the world many, many times. And I think our stories give us a lot of guidance and also speak to a life beyond the despair of the now. I think it's really hard to live in a different way without being able to imagine what that might be. We are all, in various ways, the result of our ancestors' imaginings beyond whatever they were experiencing. We're not the first generation to deal with pretty profound traumas. We probably won't be the last. Many of our ancestors were able to imagine otherwise, and I think we are the embodiment of their dreams for the future. And so we've got to dream for those yet to come, and hopefully dream a better world and a better set of possibilities for them. Yesterday, and just now, thanks to Nadia, but yesterday we were reminded by Kira to imagine the journey ahead. And so with those words in our minds and hearts, I want us all to imagine what teaching and learning in each of our respective fields could and should look like for them to be both safe and brave spaces for Indigenous teachers and learners alike. My focus will be on my and our visions, as well as actions for creating, knowing, and sharing with respect to Indigenous fisheries. The center that I and all of the people at that table over there collectively create on a daily basis is a center that was called into being 25 years after Dr. Joanne Archibald and colleagues penned a letter making the case for an endowed chair in what was then labeled Aboriginal fisheries at UBC. This letter identifies that although fisheries are of prime importance to First Nations from both cultural and economic perspectives, Aboriginal fisheries education and issues have rarely been considered fully on campus. We believe that quality education is determined by its relevance to the philosophy and values of First Nations and guided through the voices of our ancestors. That original letter is what leads to my eventual hire, the creation of our center in 2021, which is today a majority Indigenous space generating collaborative science that is with, for, and as Indigenous peoples across lands and waters. Together, we critically reflect on what keeps Indigenous peoples, fisheries, and knowledges out of the university and work to reimagine what healthy university-community relationships can look like. We're perhaps the result of the imaginings of Joanne 2.5 decades ago. And interestingly, in connection to what Jairus shared earlier with us, Joanne often speaks on infiltration, and that's been an active framing in our mindset since day one. For me personally, what healthy university community relationships means, it's about being able to do my work from my homelands, from Lisms, the Nass River Valley on the BC-Alaska border, which is the backdrop for this slide. UBC has hired me to lead community-based work and this center dedicated to these efforts, and I can do that best from within community and not the university as my primary base. I've been able to negotiate a hybrid work arrangement that puts me the majority of the time at home, able to attend feasts, to be with family like my brother Quinn on this slide and my husband John, to build strong relationships, to be there for my nation's youth, to eat fish and do all of the wonderful things at home. And the same story is true for many of our center's members. And so we have worked to create in our department, the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, an Indigenous community-based researcher pathway that enables students like the ones shown here, Nicole Jung and Casey Sterling, who's in the room, as well as Colton Vanderman, who I didn't have a picture of with these people, so he's not pictured here, but he's in the flesh, so he's right there, but allows them to work from their home contexts in whole or in part if desired. They don't have to give up family connections, community, language learning opportunities, and time on the land and water in order to complete their studies. It can be both and, not either or. And with Ki'iljuice, Dr. Barbara Wilson, also in the room, adjunct faculty in our center, and the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Simon Fraser University, their Faculty of Science, just earlier this year. I have the immense pleasure and privilege of co-teaching a multi-level hybrid course on governance and relationality in Indigenous fisheries. We meet students online from across the country and actually across the continent and host an in-person gathering, alternating each year between our respective homelands, between Niska Territory and Haida Gwaii. And we build each cohort with majority BC First Nations and other Indigenous students and cover all costs of participating and coming together in our homes through UBC's Indigenous Strategic Initiatives Fund. It is critical that as we talk about these strategic plans and strategic initiatives, that there are funds to match, to galvanize, and to move these things forward. Our goals in this work are to uphold the ancient laws of respect and responsibility as we work together in shaping and informing contemporary Indigenous fisheries practice. The learning in this space is richer because we're in place and because we're diverse, spanning nations, contexts, ages, career trajectories. In Barb's infinite wisdom, this is an old course with new guidelines. It has an ancestor that sits on the land where we are all sitting. Barb reminds me and all of us that above all, education should be fun and learning should be joyful. A mentor of mine at UBC and another force behind the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, Dr. Diane Newell, says that if you can dream it at the university, it's possible. It's just a matter of finding the pathway there. And I know this can be like a rosy way to look at the world, but it truly has been a vehicle for us and a key for us to simply jump into doing the work in the ways that we want to and need to do them, not just to be held inside the walls of the university and looking at the barriers. And so this is what I want to offer you today, and I'm going to close there. I want to emphasize this idea of offering and not giving, which is a teaching that I recently received from an elder in my nation, which Elder Herb Morvan shared with me, that offering is an ethic much better matched to taking only what you need and stepping back from this dynamic of always being asked to give. He asked, why am I giving so much of me away? And so I'll close by saying Sa'ampt Wilsum, which is a sentence that I have long understood as meaning keep up your good work, all of you, because there is so much good work being done here that we've heard over these days. But I've more recently come to understand a more fulsome and accurate translation of these Niska words and intentions, and it means to continue to make goodness and bravery, which is such a richer definition. So in Niska, we're to encourage people into action. So Sa'ampt Wilsum Toyuksitnism.
Next, we get to hear from Jacqueline Ottman, who's Anishinaabe or Soto, from Fishing Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan, who's professor and president of First Nations University of Canada. President Ottman has been recognized as an international researcher, advocate, and change maker, whose purpose is to transform practices inclusive of Indigenous leadership, methodologies, and pedagogies. For example, Professor Ottman is also one of the first Indigenous person to become the president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education. Please join me in welcoming President Ottman.
Thank you for that introduction. Anin nindono maganak mizaweka megok pepa montang dezanakas apajechi kendam nyongam miomayan. I said, hello, greetings, all of my relations. My traditional name is Mizawek Megok Bepa Motang, and that was given to me by Elder Ed Silverquell when I was an infant. And my mother had just turned 17 when I was born, so I had very, very young parents. And he heard me crying in local grocery store, and he came up to my parents and he said, I know who she is. I know who this spirit is. I've been waiting for her. I dreamt of her. And he asked for a naming ceremony. And my dad always said that when he began singing, I just stared right back at him. And he gifted me the name Mizawekemegokbepamotang, and it's given me strength. It's given me a source of identity in all that I've done, in all the years that I've been on Mother Earth. It's a very difficult name to translate to English because a lot gets lost in translation. And I always tell this story of my auntie and my uncle who traveled with me from Yorkton to my community in Fishing Lake, and they both just grappled with English translation, and that's how difficult it is to create these parallels within the academy. A lot does get misinterpreted, and there is a lot that is lost in translation. And I recall explaining my name to an elder and Dr. Reg Croshu at University of Calgary, where I was for 13 years, and he said, "This is how we say it in Blackfoot." And he understood because, as we said, Indigenous languages are fluid, they're action, and they're connected to our ecosystems. They're connected to the cosmos, and it's a type of thunder, and it's felt over a large landscape, and I recognize that thunder when I hear it. And then he did a bit of a pictograph of this kind of thunder, and then he said, "Go get it tattooed." I haven't got it tattooed yet on me, but who knows, someday. And that's an example of an Indigenous way of knowing, being, and doing. Is is name giving. It's rites of passage. It's anticipating important moments in time. It's being heightened to the ecosystem around us, and that's the environment that I grew up in Fishing Lake First Nation. My first language was not English. It was the Soto language, and I spent a lot of time with my kuku, my maternal grandmother, who knew how to pick medicines. And my medicines weren't pharmaceutical. They were poultices that were placed on my forehead. They were teas that she had blended together for me to drink. So that kind of knowledge is what's really required for the world that we're in right now. And it has been a very heavy week. And in my community, and at First Nations University of Canada, we have an elders council that provides me with guidance, and we lost an elder early this week, Elder Q-Step. And then, of course, with the Honorable Murray Sinclair, impacted many of us, and if not all of us, in one way or another. And Murray Sinclair provided the framework for the National Indigenous Identity Forum that First Nations University co-hosted with the National Indigenous University Senior Leaders Association, and we did 2 of those. The next report will be out, but before that forum was held, I had a few conversations with the late Murray Sinclair. And he said, contain it to universities, because a lot of sectors will want to get engaged, because this is an issue that is impacting all of society. It was actually really difficult to keep it contained. so definitely he is someone that I will miss. And one of the key words of this of this panel is leadership. And my background is education, and it's I began teaching in 1989, and I was a classroom teacher, and then eventually obtained my master's and PhD from the University of Saskatchewan and landed at University of Calgary. And so my whole career has been advocating for systemic change within educational systems and primarily supporting Indigenous youth through these systems, and of course Indigenous peoples within them. It's as we've heard these last 2 days, there's definitely a lot of successes and definitely a lot of challenges. And when I stepped into my topic area of research, which is Indigenous leadership development, and of course, well, that contains Indigenous perceptions of change, Indigenous perceptions of organizing. There wasn't a whole lot of literature or research in this area at all. And knowing that, just there definitely were Indigenous ways of governing and Indigenous systems of leadership, I felt it was important that that our perceptions of leadership be a part of the dialogue within academic circles, because they are so rich and actually sophisticated and complicated. And after years of investigating that whole concept and getting frustrated with it many times, and I believe for me leadership is being in service with people done in a good way. And it is a gauge that I have for myself. In a good way is it's such a packed concept, and you hear that in meetings within Indigenous circles. An elder might stop the meeting itself, and say, "We've got to do this in a good way," and that's really recognizing our ancestors. So it's putting things in perspective and learning from the patterns of the past, and situating all of that within the present state. And within that present state, also being mindful of the impact that we're having on those children not yet born 7 generations into the future. And I've heard that in the presentations also, is that our concept of time is not linear. So within each moment, we have our ancestors. And each moment, we are the ancestor. And that we are responsible for developing ancestors, and so in a good way recognizes all of that. A Western parallel would be complexity theory, but we had that. I recognize that within graduate school, that is 7 generations teaching, and so I was invited to an OECD event in Paris, and it was an international ministerial meeting 2 years ago. And I was asked to speak on Indigenous perceptions of democracy, and also reimagining education. And of course, I brought in examples of democracy or democratic parallels of democracy within Indigenous spheres, and within the Anishinaabe epistemologies and ontologies, and how all of that kind of comes into this this concept of democracy. And one thing that I learned within those few days of gathering, and I was the only First Nation person in the room, is there is this deep concern of losing rights, of losing democracy, and it's for me heightened because of what's happened in the United States yesterday, and the message is again is that we have to rise up. We have to keep on moving forward to advance some of these issues that continue to be on the table after hundreds of years. And we have to work together in order to move through this particular storm. When I was at the OECD gathering, I brought forward this one word, and it's a Soto and Cree word, and it's Waneska. And at First Nations University of Canada, we've had elders produce this video called Waneska. And Waneska means to awaken. When I was growing up, my mom, who's a school bus driver for almost 48 years, that's what she would say, Waneska. And so I think for our world, we are in this time of awakening, and we are jarred to it by many global events beginning. An example would be the pandemic. We had to just become more insular, and we had to learn new ways to communicate with each other. And a lot of us became introspective. What is of value to me, and what is my purpose, and what is my future? And in the midst of that, there was also that racial question with George Floyd, right? What is my role? And how am I contributing or not contributing to justice and challenging racism? And then came the discovery of the graves, another awakening for Canadians. Yes, it did happen. And those are stories that have been in our communities for a long, long time. If you were in your 30s, you could have been in residential school. And so the Indian Act and the mandatory residential schooling is an example of policy gone wrong, and the impact of policy on generations and generations of people. And so as leaders, we have that influence. And I don't like to use the word power, but that's really what happens is it becomes control and power, and is either healing or destructive to people. And so we're still dealing with the implications of that particular policy that began in 1876. And so what are the in relation to indigenization, and I've got my own and organized that concept in my own way. And indigenization, from my perspective, can only be led by Indigenous peoples, because we have lived experience. We know these stories. We have connections to community. And, you know, we've talked about allyship, and but there's no stepping into that lived reality, that lived experience, and it's not a romanticized space. And I have gone to so many funerals this year in my community, and in other communities, and that's the lived reality. That's the lived experience of Indigenous peoples. The opioid crisis is very real. There's more overdose deaths that are happening within our communities, and it's impacting the mental health of our students. And so indigenization, from my perspective, is led by Indigenous peoples. Decolonization is a collective responsibility. Indigenization, because our philosophies are about relationality. You think about all my relations, you know, there's different ways of saying that in our languages, but it's about interconnected relationships. And so it's a healing force. Decolonization is it is more of a challenging force. We're coming together to challenge demeaning and divisive policies and legislations, behaviors and actions, and that is a collective responsibility. And both of those lead to deeper forms of reconciliation. And in some cases, it's just the beginning. So it's conciliation. It's just a beginning. So it's I'm in a different university. It's flipped. So 70% of our faculty are Indigenous. 90% of our student population are Indigenous. 78% of those are female. Our governing body is the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, and this university has been envisioned, I could say, from 1874, Treaty 4, where education is entrenched in that treaty. And with the work that Maria Campbell and Naomi Carrier have done into the history of this university, we've also learned that in 1911, there were a group of Indigenous leaders that came together to advocate for a higher education institution that is Indigenous owned and operated. The following year, in 1912, four First Nation chiefs from Treaty 4 went to Ottawa to advocate for this university. In 1969, there were a group of visionaries that came together to once again start the process of moving towards realizing First Nations University of Canada, which began as Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. In 1976, that reality came into being with the partnership that we have with the University of Regina. And in 2003, our name changed to First Nations University of Canada. So it took 100 years of advocacy for an institution like this to be realized. We're a member of Universities Canada. And so for us, we are already an Indigenized university. We're Indigenous. And we're accountable to Indigenous knowledge systems, and we're held account to that. Elders are an everyday part of what we do. There's pipe ceremonies, there's smudging that can happen anytime, anywhere. We have a traditional campus, where a lot of our land-based experiential learning occurs. And this summer we brought together, we hosted the inaugural International Indigenous Knowledge Institute, and where there were graduate students from New Zealand, University of Waikato, and Australia, Newcastle, and Queensland University. Mongolia was going to come. They ran into visa issues, and United States and across Canada. And those students were taught by elders for a whole week. They camped, they slept in tents, and all of the activities were Indigenous. A lot of them held outside on the land, and so the language again is fundamental to everything we do. It's a cornerstone of the university. We've had students that have walked out of our university fluent when they walked into the university, not knowing a word of Cree or Soto. And we have those stories, and so it is, and I could talk so much about the topics that we've been focusing on, and the direction that we'd like to go, and would like to recognize again people like Marie Baptiste and the Smiths, and there are so many academics, Maggie, my friend, who have been steadfast within these circles in order for us to step into them and to carry those particular torches. When only yesterday, it seems like yesterday. And I heard this story not too long ago by Senator Saul Sanderson, senator of our FSIN, talked about meeting in a house because someone's home on the reserve, because it was against the law for Indigenous peoples to meet and gather and plan. And the one man hopped on the train to go home, and he had his briefcase. The train got stopped, and he got arrested because they knew that he had come from a meeting of leaders, First Nation leaders, and that meeting was done secretly, had to be done secretly. So we're in this very privileged space, a space of incredible responsibility. And I don't take that lightly, and I think when we, there's this whole topic of strategy too. Those strategies for us, when I talk to Indigenous elders, their spirit. And in University of Calgary, that one is called Itapatop. That's a spirit. It's an entity now because it's gone through ceremony. And it's the responsibility of the university and the Indigenous partners to keep that alive. It's the same thing with University of Saskatchewan strategy. That's an entity. It's gone through ceremony, and elders have guided that particular strategy from beginning to end. And so there's that responsibility by each. And this is important for non-Indigenous people to know, is that a lot of what we do is more covenantal than it is transactional. And as the pivotal word here is transformation, and that is the opposite of a transactional process. So again, there's a lot to think about. Indigenous people know about shape-shifting, and there's stories that are connected to that. And I think This is, we're in this space of adapting and shape-shifting, but we're not blending Indigenous knowledges with non-Indigenous knowledges that has been made clear by elders. Ichimigoch.
I feel as though this morning we were able to console each other with the kinds of struggles that we've shared. And we think we're out of time, but I think it's clear that we've had this afternoon is really inspiration, from stories of transformation and calls to decolonectomies and dreaming and visiting and continuing to make goodness and all of your successes. So I do encourage you to be able to take the time over the next few days to visit with these amazing people and ask advice, as I will be doing. But please, thank you very much. It's been really an honor to listen to all of you.